In this video, we'll be learning a customer decision-making rule. So how customers, make decisions, what goes on in their heads when they're making decisions in terms of what brands to purchase. So broadly speaking, there could be two different types of decision rules that customers make. The first is non-compensatory rules or models, and then the other is a compensatory rules or models. So let's further break this down, and let's look at the four different rules that are under non-compensatory models. So the first one is what we call a conjunctive rule, right? So we just have to sort of understand the definitions of each of these rules. And the conjunctive rule can be defined as the following. The consumer sets minimum cutoff scores for each of the attributes. The cutoffs for each attribute may be set at different levels, and brands that meet all of the different attribute cutoff points are kept in consideration. So for instance, let's say that you're buying a car, and the four different attributes that you're considering are price, miles per gallon, fuel efficiency, that's fuel efficiency, safety, which is like crash test, so you get stars ranging from 1 to 5, and then you can also consider warranty maybe, So let's say these are four different attributes that you're considering when you're buying a car. So then if you follow this conjunctive rule, what you're basically doing is that you can set up minimum cutoff points. So a car, I'm only going to consider cars that are, nothing over 25,000. For crash test, it has to be anything over 3-star or 4-star. For MPG, I'm not going to consider a car if it's below, 20 miles per gallon. If it's for warranty, I'm not going to consider anything if it's less than 3 years. So you can have minimum cutoffs for each of the attributes that you are considering when you're buying a car, and then you would pick the brand that meets all of the different attributes on these cutoffs. Right? So in order for a brand to be chosen, and you follow this conjunctive rule, then that brand has to meet the cutoff points for each of those brands. So the brand that meets all the cutoffs for each of these attributes would be the brand that you eventually end up purchasing if you subscribe to this conjunctive rule. The disjunctive rule would be defined as the consumer sets a cutoff score for each of the attributes. The cutoffs for each attribute may be set at different levels again. However, unlike the conjunctive rule, these cutoffs are usually very demanding, and therefore are typically set very high. So they're very high, demanding cutoffs. Brands that meet the very high cutoff points on any attribute, not all, but any, are kept in consideration. So unlike the conjunctive rule, the minimum cutoffs are set very high. Therefore, if a brand satisfies the minimum cutoff for any of the attributes that are set, then that brand would be chosen. Right? So for instance, for crash tests, it has to be 5. For warranty, it has to be, let's say, 7 years or greater. For MPG, it has to be 30 miles or greater. For price, it has to be $20,000 or lower. Then, as you can see, the minimum cutoffs are set a lot higher than before. Therefore, if there is a brand that meets or satisfies any one of those cutoffs for these four attributes, then that brand would be the one that would be chosen. So if you subscribe to these rules, then you'd be following a disjunctive rule. The lexicographic rule is a little bit more complex. So let's read what the lexicographic rule would entail. The consumer ranks the attributes by importance. He or she looks at the most important attribute and chooses the brand that performs best on that attribute. If two or more brands tie for the highest performance on that attribute, these tying brands are then evaluated with regard to the next most important attribute, and the highest performer is chosen. If two or more brands tie for the highest performance on that attribute, these tying brands are then evaluated with regard to the next most important attribute, and so on down the ranking of attributes until one brand is left. So basically, let's going back to that example of the car. So let's say that, remember we said that we have those four attributes. Now the consumer ranks the attributes, these four attributes, in terms of importance. So is it price? That's most important. And then followed by, is it warranty, then safety, then MPG? So whatever the importance of the attributes are, the consumer would rank the attributes in terms of importance. and then would choose the brand that scores highest on the most important attribute. So if, let's say, warranty is the most important attribute, then the brand that's chosen, that would be the brand that the customer chooses would be the brand that performs the best on the most important attribute, which in this case would be warranty. But if there's a tie between two brands on the warranty, then the tiebreaker, for the tiebreaker, you would go on to the attribute, the second most important attribute, let's say MPG, miles per gallon. Then you would compare the two brands that had a tie on MPG, and you would arrive at the brand that scores the highest on MPG. Right? So that's how you decide on the final brand that you choose, by choosing the brand that performs the best on the most important attribute, and then if they're tied for a tiebreaker, you would move on to the second most important attribute, and so on. So that's the lexicographic rule. And then last, the fourth one is the EBA, or what we call the elimination by aspect rule. Here, the consumer ranks the attributes by importance, and then unlike the lexicographic, sets minimum cutoffs. Remember, in the lexicographic, you do not set minimum cutoffs for the attributes. Here, you set minimum cutoffs for each attribute. The cutoffs for each attribute may be set at different levels. He or she starts with the most important attribute and eliminates all brands that don't meet the minimum cutoff point. The brands remaining are then evaluated on the next most important attribute. And again, those brands that don't meet the cutoff on this attribute are eliminated from further consideration. This continues until one brand remains. So again, the only difference between the lexicographic and the EBA is that, unlike the lexicographic, here the consumer also ranks the attributes in terms of the importance, but then sets the minimum cutoffs. So it's kind of like the EBA is a combination of the lexicographic and the conjunctive rule. Right? The conjunctive rule sets minimum cutoffs but does not rank the attributes in terms of importance, where the EBA does both. It sets minimum cutoffs and ranks the attributes in terms of the importance ratings. And then the compensatory, I won't read all of this. In a nutshell, the compensatory is an additive weighted rule. Right? So the word compensatory comes from compensation. So if you lack performance on one attribute, you're able to make up for that. You're able to compensate for that by having a higher score on another attribute. Right? That's why we call it the compensatory rule. So it's taking the weighted average. Right? So you're taking, it's a holistic approach. It's an overall approach. So that's why we call it the compensatory rule. So let's take a look at some examples. So I have here some, decision rules that, some people have, used, fictitious example, like using Mark. And then let's see what, decision rule this person used. So let's read the decision rule that Mark used. So Mark said, price was my most important feature in choosing a digital camera from the 4 alternative brands I had identified. I looked at all the digital cameras with this in mind and got rid of those whose price was higher than I was willing to pay. The next most important feature to me was print quality. So then I got rid of those remaining digital cameras whose print quality was lower than what I was looking for. The next most important feature to me was weight, and I rejected those digital cameras that had weights above a certain limit. At this point, only one digital camera remained, and this is the digital camera I bought. So what decision rule do you think Mark used to arrive at his final choice? Well, it seems like he ranked the attributes in terms of importance, but not only did he rank the attributes in terms of importance, but he set minimum cutoffs, which means then that it's the EBA. Mark used an EBA. So the decision rule that Mark used was EBA. So let's look at what Catherine used then. Catherine said, I was looking for a digital camera that had a really great rating on any one of the 5 features that were important to me. Any one, right? So it's probably not going to be lexicographic. It's not probably going to be EBA. So it has to be conjunctive or disjunctive, but it says not all but any one. So this would be an example of a disjunctive rule. So the decision rule that Catherine used is a disjunctive rule. Let's look at what Patricia used. I looked at the feature that was most important to me and planned to choose the digital camera that was best on that feature. When two digital cameras proved to be equally great on that feature, I looked at my next most important feature, and that broke the tie. So here, as you can see, no minimum cutoff was set. All Patricia did was chose the brand, the digital camera that performed the best on the most important attribute. So having said that, then the decision rule that Patricia used would be a lexicographic rule. Kelsey, I chose the digital camera that was the best when I balanced the good with the bad. So here, as you can see, when I balanced the good with the bad. So it's taking an overall approach. It's taking a holistic approach. All right. So this would be an example of a compensatory. This would be a compensatory rule that Kelsey used. Let's look at what Laura used. I ranked the features that were most important to me, and starting with the most important feature, got rid of any digital camera that did not meet my standard with regard to that feature. Then I went to the next most important feature and did the same thing, and so on down the list of features. Eventually, only one digital camera was left. So as you can see here, Laura ranked the features in terms of importance, but then got rid of the digital cameras that didn't meet the standard, which means that she set a minimum standard on each of those attributes. So having said that, then this would be an example of a EBA, elimination by aspect. Ron, I picked a digital camera that had no really bad features. So that had no really bad features, which means that, as long as it satisfied all of them, then it would qualify, which means that the decision rule that Ron chose would be consistent with a conjunctive rule, Let's look at Bruce. I looked at all aspects at once. For instance, one digital camera might have had really bad scores on some attributes, but very good scores on other attributes that could offset these. Offset's the key word here, right? That can compensate. I wanted the digital camera that was the best overall. Again, overall holistic, therefore compensatory, right? Will be compensatory. Megan, I selected the digital camera that excelled in at least one feature, Not all, but at least one. So this would be an example of a disjunctive rule. Mike, I ranked the features of the digital camera in terms of importance to me. Then I looked at the feature that was most important to me and chose the digital camera that scored best with regard to that feature, right? Okay, so ranked the importance, but did not set minimum cutoffs, which means then that this will be an example of a lexicographic. Doris, I ended up buying the digital camera that met my minimum standards on all features, not any. Therefore, this would be an example of conjunctive.